Because at the end of the day, the history that we tell to ourselves today is the history that we tell to our next generations of tomorrow. Do you have any questions?
No, ma'am.
Okay, since we don't have time now, your assignment is to read the English translations of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas of Antonio de Morga, an account of the history of Spanish colonization in the Philippines during the 16th century. You will share your insights in the class about the early history of the Spanish colonization in the Philippines. Do you understand? That's it for today, class. Thank you.
What you have just watched is a type of approach in language teaching which is implemented in a classroom setting. This approach in language teaching is called content-based approach. This approach gives emphasis on the integration of language teaching that aims in content instruction. As seen in the given scenario, the teacher provides an instruction based on a given content. Here, the language is used as a vehicle for learning. When the teacher instructed her students to read the said text, students does not only acquire the information the given content, but also develop their language skills by using the language as a tool for learning. Hello everyone, my name is John Edward MIER and with my co-reporter, Kyla Clarisse McGraw-Hill, and we will be discussing the content-based approach in language teaching. For this presentation, I will be the one to discuss the major principles, key concepts, and the models of this approach. Kyla Clarisse, on the other hand, will explain the features and examples of this approach. Lastly, we will expound the roles of teachers and students as well as share our own impression in this approach in language teaching. But before we dive into the concept and its role in language teaching, allow me to read the objectives of the content-based approach. According to Brinton et al. 1989, the objectives of content-based approach are as follows. First, to activate and develop existing language skills. Second, to acquire learning skills and strategies that could be applied in the future language development opportunities. And third, to prepare students to acquire the language while using the context of any subject matter. The term content-based approach or content-based instruction or CBI refers to a variety of instructional models in which academic subject matter is taught in a second or foreign language, such that students learn academic content and linguistic abilities simultaneously. The idea of content-based language teaching is definitely not a new one. The origin of content-based instruction can be traced back for many centuries. The concept was first advocated by St. Augustine as early as 389 AD. St. Augustine was a bishop of Hippo Regius in northern Africa. He was an ancient Christian theologian and prolific writer. He was also a skilled preacher and rhetorician. St. Augustine emphasized the importance of focus on meaning content in language learning. He also posits that we cannot achieve to learn words we do not know unless we have grasped their meaning. This is not acquired by listening to the words alone, but by getting to know the text was signified. Thus, the focus of language education should be on meaningful and relevant input rather than grammatical form in order to achieve the goal of improving linguistic competence. So what is really content-based instruction and how can we apply them in language teaching? Content-based approach or content-based instruction is defined by Snow 2014 as an umbrella term for a multifaceted approach to SFL or second foreign language teaching that differs in terms of factors such as educational setting, program objectives, and target population, but shares a common point of departure, which is the integration of language teaching that aims with content instruction. This approach suggests that language as a vehicle for learning. In addition, CBI is also based on the teaching of academic subject content to a group of students who are still learning the language. In this way, academic subject content in a new language are taught at the same time. What is the meaning of content in CBI? In his presentation on the implementation of content-based instruction in classroom setting, McVeigh emphasized that content is any subject matter or topic that focuses on certain meaning with a given content instruction. Thus, the focus is placed on the subject matter rather than the language itself. CBI can be done with anything that interests the students. What we need to remember is if the main purpose of a lesson is to not teach students about a specific linguistic feature or to have students complete an activity in order to internalize a set of vocabulary or grammatical pattern, just like in our example scenario, it's likely a content-based lesson. Here also are the key concepts in content-based approach. Language is text and discourse space. Content-based instruction sees language as a vehicle for learning and centers in linguistic entities that account for how longer stretches of languages are used and the linguistic features that create coherence and cohesion within speech events and text types. Second, language use draws on integrated skills. In a content-based class, students are actively involved in activities that link the skills such as knowledge, language, and thinking skills. Third, language is purposeful. Language used for a various purpose. It gives direction, shape, and meaning to discourse and text. When learners focus on the purpose of the language, they become engaged in the process. In order to make content comprehensible to learners, teachers need to make the same kinds of adjustments and simplification that native speakers make in communicating with second language learners. Content-based instruction is also grounded on two major principles. First, people can learn a second language more successfully when they use the language as a means of acquiring information rather than as an end itself. As stated by Martina Bex in her article entitled Content-Based Instruction in Language Classes, in a content-based lesson, language is acquired within the context of the content. In other words, students learn simply by reading about certain books or materials, listening to the teacher or when his classmate present it to the class, investigating it through discussion and research. Second major principle is content-based instruction better reflects learners' needs for learning second language. Since language is acquired within the context of the content, the learners will have the chance to reevaluate what they have learned and make use of it in other purposes. Nevertheless, the approach aims to develop the student's language and academic skills. These skills are developed unconsciously through the content dealt with. The content-based approach is also consisted of three models, which is used in different levels. These are theme-based, sheltered model, and adjunct model. The theme-based instruction refers to instruction that focuses on specific themes of interest and relevance to the learners. Unlike the traditional English class, where topics are selected from textbooks, theme-based model highlights the student-centered teaching model. This model is student learning since teachers choose interesting topics which are concerned with the student's needs, requirements, and interest, according to Sattelmis et al. 2015. Second model is the sheltered model. On the other hand, is an approach requiring students to grasp subject knowledge instead of language skills through speaking, listening, writing, translating, and reading training courses, which abandons single specific skill, according to Echeverria and Shore 2010. In sheltered model, CBI, teachers are expected to adjust their teaching materials to the level of proficiency of their learners. Sheltered model is commonly used in English-speaking countries such as Canada and United States. Students' language skills can be promoted if provided with contextualized and suitable materials in combination with enough training around the theme. This model is present in every primary schools. The last model is adjunct model. Adjunct model in CBI is anchored in two coordinated courses. It contains both a language subject and a content course. In the context of oral teaching, both language teachers and content teachers should work collaboratively to achieve one goal, and it is for the learners to understand both the content and the language. Language teachers is also expected to come up with various teaching techniques with new words and expressions. In adjunct model, a content course and a language course are conducted at the same time. Most of the time, language students take a separate class in addition to the regular course. This model is mostly present in university level.
Aside from the principles that were mentioned earlier by John Edward, Brinton 2003 offers some principles for CBI that are crucial for language teachers who want to include and promote CBI into their classrooms and institutions. The first principle is based instructional decisions on content rather than language criteria. This principle means that CBI allows course planners or material designers to choose appropriate content, which will later dictate or influence the selection and sequencing language items. Number two, language teaching should be based on integrated skills approach. This method also entails teaching numerous abilities such as reading, writing, speaking, listening, as well as linguistic element in grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. This principle represents what happens, much like in the actual world, that we use in multiple skills simultaneously in our daily interactions with others. For the the third principle, actively involving learners in all phases of the learning process. In content-based approach classroom, students take a more active role in knowledge building, both in creating and participating in classes. One of the most distinguishing features of a CBI classroom is that it is learner-centered rather than teacher-centered. Thus, the students are not reliant on the teacher to direct their learning. The fourth principle is that content should be relevant to the student's life, interests, and academic objectives. The demands of the students' educational settings are inextricably linked to the content. One of the most important things that language teacher must provide is relevance for students, by means of giving them a content which they can develop into engaged, motivated, and become self-regulated learners. Lastly, another important quality in content-based approach in language teaching is selecting authentic text and task. Considering that content-based approach in language teaching is a multifaceted approach, it does not simply focus on language skills, but rather on the acquisition of the information on the content using the language. The following are the ways that how can we use this approach in the classroom setting. Find source materials, establish content objectives and language objectives, adapt text as needed, determine key vocabulary, develop tests to help students understand the content, and assess students' learning. In terms of methods for simplifying the content, these are the things that we could apply. Scaffolding, modify the test so they are appropriate for the learners, and change the content so it will be easier for them to understand.
Now let us proceed to the roles of teachers and students on content-based approach in language teaching. First, teachers construct frameworks of interactive practices that are significant to learning and provide models of competent participation, including the uses of appropriate discursive structures and other linguistic resources. Second, create a student-centered classroom environment, where the teaching styles and strategies are based on the proficiency level of students and the scope of their interests. As stated by Dornier 2001, students will not be motivated to learn unless they regard the material they are taught as worth learning. Third, teachers must also be knowledgeable both in the subject matter and the language and must ensure that she can elicit the knowledge towards her learners. Fourth, able to keep context and comprehensibility given that content-based approach is focused on the subject matter. Teachers are also expected to provide meaningful and interacting materials that would help learners to acquire information and at the same time develop their language skills. Fifth, teachers must be able to select and adopt authentic material. With an evolving approach both in the language teaching and instruction, it is vital that teachers in content-based approach must be able to select and adopt authentic material that can be used effectively in the classroom setting.
Now, let's proceed to the roles of the students. One major goal of the content-based instruction is for the learners to become independent in their own learning process. Number two, learners are expected to become participative in terms of selecting topics and activities. Number three, learners are expected to engage themselves in different activities and assessment. And lastly, actively involved participation of both teachers and learners are highly suggested for language and content teaching.
To be honest, we don't really have any previous or general idea about this kind of approach in language teaching. Upon our research process and gathering of information, we find it hard to understand first its usage and applications because of the different versions and interpretations of this approach from different contexts. But through intensive readings and study of the approach, we were able to understand its major principle and its role in language teaching. Surprisingly, we are amazed to know that content-based approach has been in use for language teaching for how many years. Considering the nature of content-based approach, it is indeed motivating and interesting. It allows learners to learn the specific subject content while acquiring the language at the same time. Throughout this process, learners develop not only their knowledge on given subject content, as well as the language being used.
Since in this approach, the language is the vehicle for learning, which means the language that they are trying to learn serves as a tool for developing knowledge, and so they develop their linguistic ability in the target language as well. Another thing that makes makes content-based approach advantageous than other approaches is the way it developed the language and academic skills based on the contents. Surprisingly, we are actually acquiring them in an unconscious way.